Higher education, as Senator Bonoff said, is a topic for our panel of experts today. As many of you are aware, the TwinWest Chamber values lifelong learning and its vital connection to Minnesota's workforce and our state's economic competitiveness. Now I am very pleased to introduce a distinguished panel of experts and program moderator who are all leaders in the world of higher education in Minnesota. As I introduce you, please feel free to come up and take your seat here. Senator Terry Bonoff. Senator Bonoff represents Senate District 44, which includes portions of Minnetonka, Plymouth, and Woodland. She won a special election to the Senate in November 2005. I remember that. After Senator David Gaither resigned to become Governor Tim Pelini's Chief of Staff. Senator Bonoff is the chair of the Senate's Higher Education Workforce Development Committee, and additionally, she sits on the Finance, E12 Division, and Jobs, Agricultural, and Rural Development Committees. Terry grew up in Edina, Minnesota, and later attended Clark University in Worcester. Did I pronounce that right? Worcester. Oh, knew I'd massacre that. I'm thinking of the dark sauce. Worcester, Massachusetts, earning a degree in psychology and sociology. After 20 years in business, she retired in 1999 as a marketing executive from Navarre Corporation. She chose to leave her business career to be home with her 4 teenagers. Prior to being elected to the Senate, Bonoff served on many community boards, the Friends Board at the MIA, the Hopkins Education Foundation, Hopkins Minnetonka Babe Ruth Baseball, co-chaired the Hopkins Legislative Action Coalition, and was a Minnetonka Planning Commissioner. So please join me in welcoming Senator Terry Bonoff. Larry Poggemiller. On October 28, 2011, Governor Mark Dayton appointed Senator Larry Poggemiller as the new director of the Office of Higher Education. Senator Poggemiller served more than 3 decades in the Minnesota Senate. His district included both the University of Minnesota's main campus and Augsburg College. He was honored with the University of Minnesota Alumni Association's Legislator of the Year awarded in 1996, 2001, and 2005. He received his undergraduate degree in transportation engineering from the University of Minnesota and his master's in public administration from the Harvard University John F. Kennedy School of Government. He's also attended the University of Minnesota's Graduate School on Economics. Please join me in welcoming Larry Poggemiller. Marianne Benninger. Got it right. Marianne is in the 9th year of her presidency of the College of St. Benedict, a highly ranked residential liberal arts college for women in Minnesota. The College of St. Benedict is known particularly for its strengths in international education, with 20 semester-long study abroad sites on 6 continents, and for the Marie and Robert Jackson Fellows Program, offering fellowship support to students in competitive public service internships. Benninger earned her PhD in cognitive psychology from Temple University in Philadelphia, where she also completed her BA summa cum laude Phi Beta Kappa in psychology. Benninger serves on the board of the Women's College Coalition, the Board of Trustees of Minnesota Public Radio, and the Minnesota Women's Economic Roundtable. And she also chairs the Minnesota Private College Council, is also a trustee of the American University, I'm not going to get this wrong. Sharjah. I knew I'd get that one. University of Sharjah, a U.S. accredited private comprehensive university in the United Arab Emirates. So please join me in welcoming Marianne Benninger. And now I am very pleased to introduce our own Chuck Slocum, who will be moderating today's program. Chuck Slocum is all about business and community, having founded his own management consulting firm in 1990 after stints in top corporate assignments at Target Corporation and Honeywell. During this work with the 2 Fortune 50 companies, Chuck was an entrepreneur innovator in founding new corporate departments and negotiating 4 new technology-intensive business ventures. The Williston group today offers professional services in planning, executing, resourcing, and on-site turnaround. A specialty, yeah, it goes on a little while. A special, I can cut it? Okay, well let me get to the good stuff. Chuck is very involved with TwinWest, one of the best people I know in higher education and passionate about it. So let me cut it short that way and introduce Chuck Slocum.
Well, thank you all for coming, and welcome to our panelists. Business and higher ed have been friends for a long time. Absolutely critical, in part because any one of us that have run businesses or worked with others running businesses know that the quality of the workforce outranks almost anything else in terms of success of a business. And so we rely on a partnership with higher education and education institutions of all kinds to provide that workforce, and frankly, a lot of us are concerned about the workforce, and that's the context of why we asked you here today, is to talk about that. Now, in the 80s, we saw business get seriously engaged in K-12, and a lot of market-based reforms happened with Governor Perpich. At that time, such things as charter schools, open enrollment, post-secondary enrollment options, all of these major market-driven reforms were really ideas that the business community helped to foster and promote in a very serious way. And about 10 years ago, a bunch of people started getting engaged in, a bunch of business people, Art Rolnick among them, in the early learning and the return on investment of early learning people before kindergarten. And so I have one of the guests at my table, Erica Moss, has been very much involved in that and continues to work in that whole idea of at-risk kids, scholarships, and getting them ready for kindergarten. I would like to call attention to a couple others at my table today. I really forced them to come. Kurt Johnson is here. He's had a lot of hats, but he's been president of 3 Minnesota community colleges, and he's written a book about technology in higher education, and he's joined us. Susan Heegard, Larry's predecessor, Governor Palente's appointee, is here as former director of the Office of Higher Ed. And then lastly, but most importantly, the president of Hamline University is here today sitting with me. And I will say Hamline University, Larry found that out when he went out there and got his master's. Harvard now calls itself the Hamline of the East. I will acknowledge that I'm an alma mater of Hamline and served on its board of trustees. So we'll try to be fair and even-handed, but when it comes to Hamline, we can't be. Okay, the first question is going to go to President Mary Ann. And it's a long question, but I'm going to go through it because it captures a lot. 2.6 million Minnesota workers are out there. Vast majority work in the private sector, work with businesses. There's over 400,000 employers in Minnesota of all sizes registered. Currently, 56% of the Minnesota workforce, ages 18 to 64, have high school and some higher ed, and it's projected even within the next 5 years that we're going to have 70 or 75% of a workforce that can meet the demands of the future in the knowledge-based economy. Right now, today, upwards of 40% of Minnesota employers have money and say they're looking for qualified workers and they can't find them. So my question is, and it's easy, when it comes to higher ed today, what encouraging news do you have regarding our future workforce?
Thank you, Chuck. It's easy for a college president to speak about what's encouraging because that's the business that we're in, and this is graduation season, so we're particularly focused on this. As was mentioned in the introduction, the Minnesota private colleges educate about 30% of the students who receive undergraduate degrees in this state, and 40-some% of the graduate degrees. But the good news that you may not know, particularly about the Minnesota private colleges, is that we are very much educating our students for the workforce in Minnesota and nationally and globally, but particularly here in Minnesota. So for example, when you look at the constellation of majors we offer, and psychology is one of them, and we have proof here that psychology majors do get jobs because there are 2 of us at this table. But when you look at the, when you look at the degrees that we grant, it's a misperception that we are liberal arts institutions only. We are liberal arts institutions at liberal arts and sciences institutions, and we are educating students for those 10 or 12 careers that they'll have. But we're also educating them for their first job. So for example, at my institution, 5 of the degrees that we grant and 3 of our largest degrees are professional degrees where students enter directly into the workforce, in accounting, in business, in nursing, in teaching, for example. But when you look at the rest of the degrees that we grant, we're overachievers, and this is for all of the Minnesota private colleges in the STEM fields, which are so integral to workforce development in Minnesota. So, for example, our institutions grant 50% of the degrees in the physical sciences. We grant 46% of the degrees in math and computer science, and 40% of the degrees in the health fields. These, combined with those professional degrees we grant, means that the vast majority of our students are not only being educated for that lifelong career set, but they are being educated to go directly into the workforce. The other good news from the perspective of our students is that their graduation rate is stellar. So that when we invest in the state in students that go to the Minnesota Private College Council, and those investments are going directly to the students in the form of state grants, those are the only state funds generally that we receive separate from some facilities authority and bonding kinds of situations, but for the most part, we are receiving, our students are receiving the money. When we invest in those students, they're graduating not only at the highest rates in the state by far, but they're graduating at the highest rates in the Midwest. So the Minnesota Private College Council graduation rate is the highest in this entire region of the country, which makes this an attractive state for our students to come to and stay in the state after they graduate. Lastly, we know that our students right now, and I could tell you many more good stories, but I'll stick to this because there are other panelists. We know that our students right now are getting jobs. So when our businesses are successful and they are able to recruit students, there's a high probability that they're coming from our institutions. The unemployment rate for students who graduate from the private college council institutions is significantly lower than the federal unemployment rate and the state unemployment rate. So what's happening with our students is, yes, their degrees are immediately translatable into jobs. And I will leave it at that for the moment and let Chuck speak to our other...
I have another similar question that's real easy, but I'm sure that these two might want to comment on just the best single thing that's going on right now in higher ed, just to start it off on a positive note here. Larry and then Senator.
Having Terry Bonoff chosen as higher ed chair.
Oh my gosh. She's kind of a favorite at TwinWest.
Oh, I think we're about on the verge of turning around the disinvestment in higher ed. Nationally, over the last decade, there's been a disinvestment in higher education, putting more pressure on families' budgets to attain post-secondary attainment. This year, the proposal, this is the largest percentage increase in the budget that is being proposed in Minnesota, in the governor's proposal. It's about a 10% increase. And so moving from a disinvestment to an investment strategy, I think, is the most crucial thing that's going on this year. Now we just need to do it wisely.
Well, it is an honor to be the chair of the higher ed workforce development, and I think one of the most exciting things that is happening is this newfound partnership between the business community and the higher ed community. I was at a dinner this past summer at somebody's home where the chancellor was there, the president of the university, and then business leaders. I was seated next to Greg Page, the CEO of Cargill, and they were sharing with me the Itasca project's results about how we must make higher ed a priority, and specifically what kinds of things they thought that the state ought to be doing. And I got so excited by that conversation and really saw the potential for changing the trajectory of the cost of higher education, as well as the relevance and the importance of making sure that post-secondary education really becomes the laboratory for fueling Minnesota's growth economy. And so because of that dinner, I actually then did request to be chair of higher ed. And at that time, it was only going to be the higher ed committee, which is what it's called in the House. But I, having come from that dinner, requested that we change the name of it to higher ed/workforce development. And then I have been so pleased by the continuing partnership that has gone on once I've been at the legislature. So just as an example, Greg Page asked Tom Bacher, Majority Leader, and I to come meet with them last week in Minneapolis. I had to end committee time early to come and meet with them. And the reason he asked us to come is he said that he knew that in this whole budget debate, there would be a lot of pressure to move dollars here or there, and that the House was actually recommending a much smaller target than the Senate. And he said, people are going to tell you, just give money to students, just give it direct to students. And he said, I want you to know that wouldn't be smart. You must invest in these institutions. You must let MnSCU do their leveraged equipment so that those kids can be trained to be in manufacturing. You must give us the kind of students that they can hit the ground running. And so based on that support, and we were able to have a strong bipartisan bill. We did support the governor's recommendation to do not only that large investment, but then we added accountability measures where we've got performance metrics where we say both systems, we're going to hold back a certain amount of funds if they don't meet the metrics of the graduation rate, and several others, lowering overall costs of delivery. And then just another word about the partnership with the not-for-profit privates, because we are so proud of really the shining star that they are. And we're proud to support all of our students, regardless of what path they choose. We've got folks here from Rasmussen. Our state grant program is meant to allow these students to go to wherever they get in and provide the foundational support for that.
Okay, so much for the good news. Thank you very much. Director Pogemiller, you have almost 500,000 students in 133 different universities, colleges, community colleges, trade schools who are involved in higher ed that you have a policy responsibility for. And I wanted to ask you, how effective have Minnesota businesses and employers been, including Greg Page of Cargill, in communicating their specific workforce needs, and what grade would you give higher education institutions in responding to those?
An effort just led by MnSCU, Chancellor Rosenstone and the trustees, and the Department of Deed had, I believe, 55 meetings around the state with business leaders. And this happens every 5 or 10 years. But these were, and I attended numerous of these, and this was a pretty robust discussion to discuss this exact point, the intersection between post-secondary and workforce eligibility. And what they heard, I think, to summarize, was we should not choose between kind of the liberal arts education and a technologically prepared education. We have to do both because of the high-level nature of our economy. We need employees, we need students prepared, and they need to be lifelong learners who can work in groups, be creative and innovative, and adaptable to change at the workplace. And so you need to emphasize not only this effort to have a liberal education or a baccalaureate or an associate, but you need to emphasize specific skills within that to make them employable ready immediately. And not to view it as a terminal education, like I'm going to get educated and then I'm done and then I'm going to work. It's going to be an iterative activity between post-secondary and the workforce throughout your lifetime. And there is a place for all of our institutions, a role for all of our institutions to play in that, and they need to become just more flexible in terms of delivery time and type of delivery so that these growing number of adult learners can enter these institutions. That's why you kind of see this growth in both the for-profit sector and the community college tech sector. That's where the largest growth has been in the entrance into post-secondary in the last decade.
And you give that a pretty high grade.
Work in progress. Depending on
Okay.
where you live, the institutions have adapted well. In some parts of the state, they have not adapted as well, and I think it's a work in progress.
Okay. Senator Bonoff, you deal with silos all the time, and business people sometimes are confused about education silos. And we have the early learning, and we have the K-12, and we have the higher ed and various aspects of higher ed, and we have grant programs and loan programs and all sorts of things. Businesses deal with that within their own work and have to figure out how to move ahead and make progress. It's a continuum, as Director Poggemiller said. How well is this system coming together and working as chair of the Senate Committee of Higher Ed?
There are several different ways to look at the silos question. You can look at it within each system itself. So for example, the University of Minnesota, there's been that whole ongoing public discussion about their administrative costs, and you could say one of the reasons why the administrative costs have grown at a rate that probably most of us in the room would say we don't like, would be because of the silos issue, whereby each school and college, you have a new idea, a new major, it goes out this direction, everybody on their own kind of creates their infrastructure to support that activity, and thus you get growth, 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 and so now we have to step back and say, is that economically sustainable? And I would assert that it's not. And so we as a higher ed committee have pushed very hard to change that behavior. We started by demanding the analysis be done, the spans and layers analysis. Then we followed up by having the report, by putting in our performance metrics. We pushed very hard to get a specific dollar amount just in the next year, which was a $15 million reduction. In addition, we put language in there directing the university to continue reporting their plan to lower costs. And MnSCU, I will say, with regard to the silos within their own institution, has made dramatic advances. They have embarked on a whole shared services initiative. They came forward and committed to reduce $22 million of administrative costs. And by the way, the university did the same. They just didn't have the kind of plan that MnSCU had. So there's those silos.
Are you satisfied with the accountability of these investments, that we have the systems in place to measure how well our kids are doing in the workforce, or are you working on that? I think
We are working on that. We have a new longitudinal data system called SLEDS, which really we're in the infancy of tackling many of the things that you referred to. And I just have to go back and thank you, Chuck, for the work you did in early education. The fact that we now have these scholarships in our bill and the work, I remember we started that so long ago. But so, having people like you be asking these questions is the first start. But we put these kinds of accountability measures in our bill, but we are in the infancy stage.
Okay, President Mary Ann, I want to get at the qualities of character, or the qualities of the soft side of education. You're the only one actually running an education institution. And business has needs for certain kinds of abilities. How are you reading that? What do you think are the most important qualities of character and skills in a general way that a future employee needs to have, and it's reflected in your curriculum and your work?
Thank you, Chuck. I'm going to push back a little bit on the soft side because I think that's a term that we use. But these skills that we're talking about, critical thinking, writing, speaking, working in teams, they actually are measurable and they're actually definable. And institutions that are focused on them as one component of education can do a very good job at making sure that we actually do teach to that. So for example, everyone is familiar with the need for internships and the need for experiential education. Those are the places where students put together the knowledge that they gained in the classroom in terms of the factual structure of what they need to learn, whether it's technical education, job-related, or whether it's in the finer performing arts. It doesn't matter. There's a corpus of things they need to learn. But we understand, I think, perhaps better than ever before in this country, and I think the Great Recession helped us understand this better, is that we have to directly tie those factual things that they learn in class with the kinds of things that Chuck is calling soft skills. So the way that we do that is through internships and experiential learning requirements. And every institution in the Minnesota Private College Council has some form of that, and we're able to do this very well because we have a low faculty-student ratio. It's about 12-to-1 on average. And what we can do is make sure that when students are in internships, that they're not simply they're doing a job or working at the copying machine, that they're actually working on the internship components in a way that meets these soft skills. So the internship provider is a partner in their education very directly and in an accountable way. We have institutions that have all different approaches to that. At my institution, every single student is required to do experiential learning that ties in with their classroom work. So I think we have a much greater understanding that these things don't happen naturally and students in college don't make the connection directly, that we have to work from the very beginning to make sure that we instill a direct connection between those and the
You know, I do a fair amount of mentorship with kids, and I hang with them for a long time. And these internships that they've been able to have while they're in college have often turned into jobs. Could you talk about how internships turn into jobs?
Absolutely. Well, students generally will look for an internship through a structure at our institutions that will support their seeking that internship. So there's a clearinghouse, if you will, at all of our institutions that matches the student with the internship. So as we begin to work with the student when they first arrive about what their career aspirations might be, the goal is to tailor that internship in a way that will help them move and make progress during to that career aspiration. And I think that's part of the reason why our graduation rates are so high, is because students can see very early on, even though they're taking a degree like history or math or computer science, how that directly relates to the business world. So we endeavor to provide internships that do exactly that, Chuck.
And many have ended up in full-time jobs, right?
Well, our students overwhelmingly end up in jobs. Go to the websites of our institutions, go to the website of the Minnesota Private College Council, and you can see the accountability facts right there. The council, I think, is very good about putting out there in aggregate the strengths of all of our institutions. You have a booklet on your tables entitled the Minnesota Private College Council, but you can find all that on the web directly. At my institution, you can find every job that every student got who graduated in 2011.
Okay.
So not by name, but
Thank
by
you.
corporation and major.
Okay, Director Pogemiller, I'll give you a real easy one. We've had for 25, 30 years an achievement gap, and right now the poor are getting poorer in Minnesota. The costs of higher education are high and getting higher. The average student combined graduates from college, four-year college, with a $30,000 debt. I know that differs from school to school, but why don't you just tell us in the next couple minutes how we ought to solve that? I'm sorry, your time is up.
That issue is the key economic issue for Minnesota right now. We have a very high attainment rate nationally relative to other states in terms of post-secondary attainment for certificates, degrees, etc. We are at risk at not being able to maintain that high level if we don't close the achievement gap and attainment gap for kids of color and poor kids. It's that simple.
Immigrant kids, primarily.
It's that simple. We will stunt our economy if we will just not have enough workers if we don't close that gap. And so the strategy that is going on right now is an investment in pre-K, early childhood, the largest historical investment being made in the history of Minnesota, and investment in post-secondary education. That is what's going on with I would call, I need to be careful how I say this, a maintenance budget in K-12. Is that a fair way to say that? The higher investments literally are in early childhood and post-secondary. And all the individual strategies like internships and partnerships our apprenticeships for experiential learning are attempts to feed into that in a way that will get the right kind of workers with the right kind of attainment, so that we won't stunt our economy. And in K-12, there's continuing attempts to bring accountability and better results there, charter schools, et cetera, other things. But in post-secondary, the attempt is post-secondary is a market system. 80% of the dollars, roughly, come from families. So only 20% of it is public money. So it already is a market system. The key element is how can the policymakers like Chair Bonoff and Governor Dayton strategically invest $264 million to tweak that market to get better results. And the dual purpose is more education for everybody, but also higher attainment for under-attaining populations, which tend to be low income and students of color in Minnesota by large, large numbers. And that is a early childhood to prepare them to be successful in K-12, more pressure on K-12 to actually get results for those kids, and then finally an accessible post-secondary system that meets the aspirations and abilities of each student so that they're prepared for the workforce and lifelong democratic action.
Larry's pretty much solved this one, but do you guys want to comment on the same issue?
I would. There's two things that I'd like to point to. One is a new effort to align the K-12 system with the post-secondary system. So, for example, specifically, we talk about the amount of remediation that kids need when they come out of the K-12 system and go into post-secondary, and the amount of kids who don't graduate from post-secondary who take remediation is disproportionately high. If you have to remediate, chances are you're more likely to say, forget this whole thing. I'm not getting credit. I hate this course anyway. I'm not good at it. All those things mean you don't graduate. And so we're trying to figure that out. How can we stop that? And so we've got now in our new K-12 bill, we're moving towards, instead of doing the MCAs or the grad tests, doing a suite of, the ACT test, so that the very test that the post-secondary uses to say is somebody good enough to get in is the test that we're going to start earlier in high school and then provide intervention when the kids aren't yet ready. And that's a huge breakthrough. There's some fighting going on between various groups about should we say you have to achieve a certain ACT in order to move on based on what you're trying to accomplish, and that's a discussion that will continue. So that was the one thing in terms of this overall achievement gap, that one issue. Another thing is we have to find a way to lower the overall cost because it's not sustainable and the kids cannot bear the burden. We cannot have the kind of debt that is greater than credit card debt in our country and think it isn't going to somehow sink us economically. So one of the things that Larry and I in partnership have done to kind of move Minnesota forward is to open up this question of MOOCs, for example. It's just one idea, the massive online open courses. And that started, out at Stanford and Harvard and MIT, and we brought those folks to our committee and they shared it, and now we've got language that allows them those kinds of courses to be offered. And I think you'll see that moving down into K-12 too, because it's a whole new way and a cost effective way to engage students.
Great.
I wanted to go back a little bit to the affordability question, the loans, and educating a diverse population of future workforce in Minnesota. When you really look at where our students go to school, there is a misconception that the students who in the low-income categories and underrepresented students are not going to the private colleges. And in fact, the reality of it is that 25% of our students have incomes under $50,000 a year in their family, and 18% of our students are American students of color. So one of the things that we want to look at is making absolutely sure that the students in those most vulnerable populations have exactly the same choice factors as the students who are more economically advantaged. Because ultimately down the line, 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, we don't want to see a bifurcation that mirrors the technology gap or mirrors the skills gap between the different groups. We want students from all of our economic groups, our racial groups, our ethnic groups, new Americans, 10th generation Americans, we want all of them to have the same distribution of opportunities and skills to make this strong. So I think that's something that's very important for us to look at. On the issue of loans and affordability, I think we have to really drill down and understand what's happening in affordability in our state and frankly across the nation. If you look at the private colleges, it is true that our sticker prices have gone up, but our net tuition, that is the dollar that the student actually pays and that the institution actually uses for programming, has actually gone down since 2002. So adjusted for inflation, our net tuition is something like 2.3% less than it was in 2002. And what that says, it goes back to what Larry said, is the state has been disinvesting. So what's been lost and who's paying for higher education is not the families and not the institutions. It's really that we've stopped investing at the state level and at the federal level, and it is very exciting. And I want to thank Senator Bonoff for her committee's work in being so engaged and listening so well, because really what we have to do is take the dollars that the state can distribute and do, as Larry said, is make sure that we are finding the right ways to incentivize the dollar that the students are investing.
Whoops, I keep bumping this thing. How many of you out in the audience today are with companies that have had trouble finding qualified workers you're willing to hire, but you're not? Could you talk about your experience and maybe throw out a question then?
Sure. My name is Steve Carolowski. I'm a small business owner. I own a media buying company called Senator. We specialize in media planning and media buying. And so trying to find people that are in that specific niche, that have good math skills, that have really good skills for writing so things aren't going out wrong. It's really hard to do. We get tons and tons of resumes coming in with errors and errors and errors all over them. And so that's really one of the hard things for us is to find. It sort of seems like many of the kids coming out of school right now are very educated, they're very smart, but they don't have the social side of it also to learn about how do you deal in a corporate environment also. So that's two of the things that we find.
Anybody else have a similar kind of experience that you're kind of frustrated with now? Bruce, you must. You hire a lot of people. You must be having these experiences. Or are you finding all that you need?
I have to tell you that in our group, we end up having to do a lot of training ourselves, and so we come to terms with that. So we really don't have the issues that most.
In the same way. Well, I'd just like to note in China, where they're re-energizing their higher ed and their education systems, they place a high priority on reintroducing the liberal arts now, which is kind of counter to where we've been going. And that's an interesting notion. My guess is it's trying to humanize the potential workers more, to be more human.
Well,
Go ahead.
I think we have to force ourselves to avoid thinking about this as an either or. I think what the hearings or the town meetings or panels that Minskew heard, again, reinforced what we had heard a decade ago on this. We need a combination of these soft skills or interpersonal skills to work in groups and be creative, and some specific things job ready that businesses need. And I think we need to either incentivize or force our institutions to deliver those kinds of graduates. And we can do that. And we're looking more and more at what Finland is doing in terms of that balance, where you get both of those things. And if you think about it as a lifelong learning activity, it's easier to think that that's possible, because it's not one job you're going to have. It's going to be quite a few jobs. And the experiential learning activities that that both MnSCU and the privates and others are trying to work on should help with that. We just think it would help on the debt side if that more and more of those experiential learning experiences were paid rather than volunteer.
Sure. I thought about the final question being yours, Kurt, regarding the online and technology issues, since you authored a book on this subject. And would you ask the final question, and then Mike will come back and close us out. And I want to ask us all to thank our panelists. It's been very instructive. We appreciate it. Go ahead.
Well, I'll start with that because I did mention the MOOCs issue, and we think that that you're on the right track, that that's exactly what's going to happen, and that our institutions are leaping into it. They aren't being bystanders. The University of Minnesota already has an agreement to offer these MOOCs, and I spoke to the superintendent of Hopkins the other day. We were having coffee, and I suggested that he find out how the K-12 system could model this. I think one of the opportunities is to let our kids, you know, from wherever they are in the state, have access to the best and brightest professors in the world and be able to have the kind of global conversations around the world. I mean, just imagine the kids sitting, you know, right now we have the, in Cook County, they can't get all the way down, for example, to our institution. So there's a model whereby those kids in Cook County come into this little room and they, through a video conferencing, can take a class anywhere in the state. So you just expand that and imagine that similar kind of activity in a way that we can't even envision sitting here taking place, where they can not only just sit as an observer but then engage with the international world. And I think that will change things. But then we have to also say, how can we nurture, because do we want our kids to no longer be having that, you know, 4-year experience where they're living on campus and having that social environment? That's a very important treasure that I don't think we want to lose. So I think it's a question that will need a lot of exploring, but holds the potential for great change and really exciting opportunities for growth.
And Kurt, it may surprise you that I agree with you, even though I'm the president of an institution that is largely doing face-to-face education. I think you're exactly right. But I think, and this speaks to what Senator Bonoff said, I think that what's going to happen, or when I try to imagine it as best I can, and I'm a cognitive psychologist who knows a lot about how humans think, we're going to be using this form of education to acquire that kind of basic knowledge that I told you about. But unless virtual reality becomes much different than we can even imagine, we still have to understand whether we're talking about training a tool and die maker or a machinist or a brain or neurosurgeon. We still have to understand how we're going to break through that largely two-dimensional space that you get on the internet to combine that with the type of experiential education that someone needs to actually work in the real world. So I don't necessarily see our institutions of higher education non-existing at all. I see them exploiting this new approach to learning and the facts and taking it and expanding it so that students can learn things much more rapidly. You might see a faster time to degree for a particular issue. But we're going to have to come to terms, particularly in the state of Minnesota, in a state like Minnesota where we're so proud of our civic engagement. We're going to have to come to terms with other questions too. How do you be a responsible citizen if most of your interactions are with 160,000 people all over the world when you have to be civically engaged locally? So I think what will happen is the questions will change, and if we're good at this, we'll figure out how to exploit this to the greatest extent we can for the good of the state.
You're awfully good. In education, they talk about this emerging use of technology in a kind of a blended model of information transference plus in personalization and freeing up faculty members to be more like Socrates in the cave in terms of interacting with their students to take them to higher order interconnections and thinking, whether it's for the machinist or for the neuroscientist. And so I think what will happen is the institutional providers will either adapt to that or they will die. Because when you have MIT and Harvard and Stanford moving on this front already, people are going to ultimately follow or they're going to die. And so I think you're going to see really, in a decade or two, you're going to see really enhanced blended models, much more personalization to the individual learner, and it will start to permeate not just higher ed, but it will drive itself into K-12 in a way that will help us overcome the achievement gap that we have because of this level of personalization that will be possible.
Oh, you want? Oh, I thought you were going to say something more. Okay, thank you very much to our panelists again. I hope all of you leave with some takeaway that can be applied to your business or your personal family. I'm going to ask the panelists maybe to stay around a little bit because some of you may have questions. You can approach them up here. And this is key. I mean, we have the people here that are right involved with the heart and soul of education and the future of Minnesota. So don't be bashful to tell them. They're very open to hearing about these
And I have
things.
to go take votes. I'm getting many texts. Where are you? Where are you? So I
you do have to
apologize.
leave.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
okay. So thank you to Senator Terry Bonoff, Larry Poggemiller, Mary Benninger, and Chuck